Other side.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so it's going.
Her mom has it. It's like her
Yay!
Yeah, which I was getting nervous. I hadn't heard from her. She was like, I didn't read the whole thing. And she's like, you actually need it. I was like,
Okay, now, but how do I know that it's recording? Hello. Hi. So it says that it's broadcasting live, but how do I know for sure that it's recording? That's what I don't
Yep.
know.
It's doing it.
So it just does it.
Yep.
I don't have to like tell it to do it.
Nope, because you hit that
Oh,
start
okay.
broadcast, and
Okay.
now it's current says live right there.
Okay, so that means it's good. Okay, we don't have anybody on yet, but that's okay. All right, so I'll stop my screen sharing.
Stop. Yep.
Okay, but yep, there we go. Hi.
I think we should have a dinner party. Do we have
We don't. I have a PowerPoint. We could just have that circulating in the background.
So it's when you said stop broadcasting, so you just stopped the screen share.
I stopped the screen share so that if people came on, they would see that it's not just that. Okay, so this appears to
Did
be
you send them
working.
a link, or how did you get
A link, yes. They have the Google Hangouts on air like link. So I believe I did this correctly, but have never actually done this before. So I was like,
also be recording on YouTube.
that's what I thought.
Yes.
And I should be able to just send that.
I know, right? We can totally do that, like dissertation, defense,
Because you're going to be
presentation.
projecting yours to there, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to have just Trixie.
Yeah, you're gonna have to.
friend Trixie.
Is there a hashtag for this occasion?
Actually,
you know, I
Yeah,
can do some,
Okay, there we go.
Yes, exactly.
How
I
about
love it.
do this disc?
Because you know, I have to know what other people are thinking. Wow.
Okay, well, you tell me. You tell me what
I think
hashtag.
Dr. Pitcher is going to be the.
Or Dr.
Yeah.
Rocks. Or... Oh, Trace, how are you?
I'm great, actually.
You go by my art?
Yep, I just started on chapter 5 today.
Let's turn it on.
Maybe Dr. Pitcher PhD. Make sure you're just
I was like,
emphasizing.
your room's so big. I have 33 chairs.
I mean, in my life.
Queers defending queers.
I invited Jeff. I told him you should just.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Right, it could be a reused hashtag. I love this.
Queers defending queers. That is the hashtag.
Actually, that is a good one.
Hi.
All right, Bailey.
Oh.
Desktop.
Get a break from Higher Ed Live.
Do I get a break?
From Higher Ed Live for a
No,
couple
that's
weeks.
not happening. Oh, is Bailey having tie problems? I was having tie problems too, but I think mine's fixed.
They were big ones.
Yeah, is mine? What's it doing the thing?
I mean, it's like not.
Well, that's because my top button is undone because I don't like that thing.
That's fine. That's better. It was just like
Are you
super
gonna-
flat.
Are you going to present from there?
Yeah. No, I'm gonna sit.
Which is
Yeah.
acceptable.
I was like, I actually think I present a little better when I sit.
Well, John, from 133, you can't stand up because.
Is it wobblier than normal?
Yeah, no,
I feel like it's not that way.
right there.
I always remember we were in that small.
Yeah, this table actually opens and shit like that. So this is actually not connected.
This thing.
Frightening.
All right, gather.
Yeah, but Cecilia's desk.
So I was thinking, we don't tell jobs interview candidates, we put them there, they're like, what?
You just start flying away.
You and Django are super talkative.
So we were talking about being in the small room for the proposal and how me and Jake were like, this up against this table.
I know, yeah, and they made it a tiny bit easier, they moved something so we had a tiny bit more space, but it's still, you want to, it is not a place you want to have an unhappy meeting.
Right, yeah. Oh, yeah.
It is not a place, if you have something that might go badly, you don't want to be.
I can think of some specific people you might not want to.
All together.
Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely if you're like, this is gonna, if you have, occasionally this has happened to nobody here, occasionally you
you.
have to have the meeting where you're asking the chair and the student are at such a place where you need to bring the rest of the committee to
Help.
move things along,
Yeah.
break the log jam. And those are not comfortable.
Buffer's probably the wrong one.
Yeah, not buffer so much as, I think.
How does this look?
Hey, Trixie, how are you?
Ooh, that looks dreadful. Okay, we don't like that resolution. It's the resolution.
How are you? Can you hear me? Okay, good. So what we're doing is, I've got you on my own laptop, and in a minute, I'll turn your face to Eric.
Oh,
Eric is
need
gonna
it.
have on the screen, he's also Google Hangout in some of his participants and others. So, but we decided to give you your own and be separate.
Change what? Like, should I mess with the display or I might have
Less displays, but more.
like
Like go to your.
Oh, the.
Yeah, it's just, it's too many, is what it is. And what you
See it along this.
Oh,
So
it's
click
here.
on.
so I bet it's under
We'll have make it.
layout or something.
Expand this out a little.
There's Brendan, and yeah, okay, we got.
Slide
Oh,
size.
slide there. So what should I?
9.9.
Oh, I bet that would fix
As long
it.
as it doesn't.
It was like
Does it change your photos to look good? Oh no.
that one doesn't, but that's not. Oh, is that a problem? Will it like actually make it look like that on there?
Yeah, that doesn't work. It's
Okay.
not gonna have it on the thing. So go back. I think it's fine if it just extended.
Because that's too.
Yeah, feel free.
Okay. I think we'll just. I think I'll just leave it.
No, it is totally fine.
All right.
Okay, so
we
it's
have
like-
all the thing here, so I'm actually gonna turn you, yours is same between you and Brendan.
Are you
I
someplace?
think it looks nice. I don't think unless you would know. It's
It's like, so how does the next one?
All right, so.
So that looks fine.
I'm about to.
How does,
Yeah, that looks okay. Oh, Laverne looks okay, I think. Wait, what is it saying?
Hello, folks. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, that looks
to,
fine. Okay.
Future Dr. Pitcher's dissertation defense. As is the custom in Hale, we will ask the candidate and all other folk not on the committee to step out for a minute. The committee will have a chance to talk. This is not typical in every department. We do that for ourselves and parts of the committee can be on one page. And be a little less random when we finally get to ask questions.
You can leave your food behind.
You can leave. You will not be out here long. And Eric, the amount of time in the hallway is not related to anything.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get distracted and forget.
Related to how long you talk.
Yeah, so don't.
Don't fret.
No, it's not. It's truly.
Those are the things I'm gonna say.
Okay, here we go.
All right.
I'm just gonna go to the bathroom.
All right, that's a great idea.
How are you?
Good.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that, Trish. I didn't mean to spin it. There really are like 25 people here. I guess they'll make noise. Okay, so thank you all. I know it's not the shortest dissertation we've ever had. I hope you enjoyed reading it anyway. We see a lot of Erich in it, and Erich is really eager for places to make it better and move it forward. So, Trixie, you have how long with us today?
I'll be here till about 10 till 2, so.
Okay. All right, that's good to know. Okay. I hate to put the outside person on the spot. So maybe Riyadh or Brendan, if you want to sort of let me know if there's any big things you want to make sure we cover.
There were just a couple of things. It's more conceptual. I thought that it was a very conceptual. And there was a couple of things, and actually Brendan and I were talking about this. He seems to use this metaphor of Spivak's outside of the teaching machine, but it's not really elaborated throughout. And maybe just, it's not huge, but it seems to be a central concept.
Yes.
And I was going to ask him questions about that. And then that was one major thing. And then the other thing is, and probably this is your work, academic capitalism and neoliberalism sometimes kind of becomes a little bit parallel. And I was wondering how he thinks of those two. Are they the same or different? And then I have a question about intersectionality, but not related to the work, just in terms of implications, because I thought he did a fantastic job bringing up intersectionality. Those were the three. Yeah.
Great. Brendan or Trixie?
Dixie?
I thought it ran really well. The biggest impression I got was almost of the repetition of like the kind of three theoretical methods he's using,
Uh-huh.
he repeated them in so many places and so many times it felt defensive
Oh, interesting. Okay.
to me. And so I just want to know what that's about.
You know, that's a great point, and that I think is probably one of the things that, because we go through different drafts of things, and it was not a linear drafting process.
Right.
I think
and I think that probably is what it is.
Yeah.
And so when you suddenly read it as a whole, you're like, oh, it's here, and it's here, and it's here.
Yeah.
Right.
And I did read it through all the way, but again, it's so, I read so much of it.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that would be a great thing to ask him about, and if we have ideas about how he could reduce some of that. He was already working on a book proposal, which is great. We're literally putting some more stuff into it. What are you doing?
So this specific question was one also that I had. It's not in his framework,
Right.
and yet it seems to be the most important concept in terms of motivating analysis. So it'd be interesting to hear some discussion about that. Actually, I have a question. Is the extent to which would be useful for Erich to push a little bit on how this is a study of higher education? If this is, parts of this are to be published in higher education outlets, I would, not in terms of the dissertation, but if I'm thinking about reviewers and editors, and so how is this about higher education? And then the other question that is also sort of bigger, and I'm not sure it necessarily needs a tremendous amount of attention when it comes to actually the dissertation itself, but it's also the same thing that we have in a chapter on markets, neoliberalism and academic capitalism. It felt forced, like it was just sort of forced in there, and just the relationship between those concepts and the pressure to. At points there were clear connections, pressures to make enrollments, and there were some specific implications there. But on the other hand, some of those things are very, very generic.
So it kind of piggybacking on that idea is that in that kind of chapter, the specificity of childhood academic experiences seems to be lost in ways than the other chapters where it's very nuanced and you really get the differentiation between the transfer academic experience and other numerical qualities.
Yeah, it's exactly, and we went around that a number of times around. And some of it also comes along someone studying around race, and sometimes it's like, how is this about? Why? What would be different if we heard this from other people? And what is the value added from this? And he just got back a protection from a journal. I don't even remember which one. It wasn't a higher ed journal, but the critique really had to do with like, well, these are such privileged people. Why is this a problem? So I think these questions around like capitalism, and trans intersection, and then how much is it about higher ed? I think he's had this recent experience of just hearing from reviewers like, kind of not why does it matter, but like. So I think he's been thinking about these things in ways that'll help.
And sorry not to dominate, but it's just such an interesting study. There's so many questions. And one of the underlying ideas that I think that has to be addressed or thought about too is oftentimes when we study minoritized bodies, it all becomes a numeric game. So this idea that, oh, well, the number of times that academics is so small, why should it be a significant study, which is another way of majoritized logics to use to kind of undermine. But I think it's something that we might have to ask him to think through, given what you just said about the earlier comment, the numerics as being used as a way to kind of subjugate.
Right. Anything else, Trixie, before we bring it back in?
The one other question that I would ask, and thinking about future audience, there are references throughout about the T being tacked on to lesbian, gay agendas and or this treatment by gay and lesbian faculty. And I'm interested in what, from the study, people would say to those people, what they would say to people that they would like to see as allies, but perhaps don't.
Yeah.
And how you might address that particular audience.
think it's a great way, because it comes through so sharply. There's clearly, what is the white lesbian librarian academic who does not fare well in Erich's analysis of that. I was like,
and there's the chair of an department.
Yes.
Who sends students off to somewhere else, and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, the chair of the LGBT studies department. Like, there's some modestly hair-raising tales in here. On behalf of my people, the lesbians. All right, I will. Trixie will turn you around. We'll get folks back in here, and I'm pretty excited. Also, I will say, Erich texted me yesterday. He was practicing, unable to get through his first slide without crying. So I said, "You can cry, you can not cry.
Yeah.
It's your gig." So
it's a very embodied piece.
yeah, clearly. So I'm just so proud of him in like the least condescending way. You know, it's like being proud always seems a little colonial as well, but I'm like, no, I'm just proud of it. It's great work. All right, so that will be Erich in just a second.
Yes. Lovely earrings.
I know, he's working the whole thing, and his slides match his outfit.
Yes. I have a slide.
Okay, you've got the slides separately, all right.
Oh, yeah. Great finding.
Is that the hashtag?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, Trixie, the hashtag for the class of thumbs is queers defending queers.
And Dr. Physics too, but we'll be interchanging.
Okay. I brought the form.
You brought the form.
In case you decided that you wanted to go forward. Okay, so it looks like some folks have joined us online. So can you, I was like, you should be able to tell me if you can hear okay. Oh, thank you, I need those. Okay, seeing no complaints, I'm gonna go forward. All right.
The screen's showing.
Oh, yeah, just want to pop the
Oh, did it like just shut itself off?
Probably.
Oh, okay. I think you just, yeah, you just, it should be all set to go.
Yeah, second go was saying it wasn't good. Here we go.
That one is not on though. Okay. Maybe? It's in process. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and begin. Hi, Trixie. Your hair looks great. Before I begin, I want to spend some time having a heart-to-heart. And during my first class that I ever took as a doctoral student, Kyle Greenwald said to me that one's research should break your heart, or else it's just not worth doing. And this project and this doctoral journey broke my heart in many ways. So in my acknowledgments, I talked about heartbreak in that traditional way of loss, grief, devastation. I grieved alongside participants, but sometimes my heart broke open. The steely walls that I had placed around my heart rusted with the voices and experiences of participants who created little cracks and fissures along the fault lines of my heart, making little spaces for light and love and a sense of solidarity, shared struggle and community. So I'm filled with love and hope and pride as I come to the near end of this journey. And my heart opened as I began to see the importance of Joy's word, who inspired the title for this dissertation. Joy said, "I've become professionally other." Joy is a male to female transsexual woman. She's Jewish, a full professor, a parent, a spouse, and a quintessential academic. She's thoughtful and deeply passionate about her work. But Joy and I have never actually met in person. We've only met over the phone. And she participated in this pilot study and continued with me and 5 others so that we might clear a path together. We stood at the edge of the forest, and their participation allowed me to shine the light on the experiences of 39 trans academics. This is the first study of its type, and to date, it's the largest qualitative inquiry into workplace experiences of trans people. So my sincere hope is that this work can clear a path for new lines of inquiry and knowledge production by and for trans people within higher education and beyond. For far too long, the cis gaze has shaped studies of trans people, and this study changes that path. I situate this study within a larger context of studying the academic profession, but also about the evolving nature of diversity within higher education. I offer 5 rationales for this study. First, there's been an increased visibility around trans issues, particularly in the media, which has made some trans lives hyper-visible, so typically those who have binary identifications, and other lives virtually invisible, so particularly non-binary identified individuals. Therefore, while studying trans academics, it's important that we humanize their experiences and stop treating trans people as objects of information. And while we're doing that, it's important to advance gender autonomy, but also for gendered possibilities to proliferate rather than be foreclosed. And through this research, right, it's possible to begin to realize that trans academics actually hold profoundly unique perspectives about gender and the ways in which it's operationalized within academic institutions. These vantage points have been largely ignored within the extant literature, but are vitally important, both within the scholarship about LGBTQ people and beyond. It's also widely understood that trans people face workplace discrimination. But also there are potential benefits that increasing knowledge about this population could have for non-trans academics, particularly the inner workings of gender, which could improve the experiences of those who transgress a variety of kinds of gender norms. My dissertation was guided by 4 research questions, which are on the screen now. With these rationales in mind, right, these questions are sort of arriving out of that rationale. The first question, how do within organizational processes or micro-foundations or inequality regimes shape trans academics' experiences? What are the primary institutional logics that shape the experiences of trans academics from diverse backgrounds? And how, if at all, are they able to resist both the inter and intra-organizational norms and processes that exist? Oh, wait, I'm not ready yet, just kidding. Last question. From the perspectives of participants, what organizational and policy contexts create supportive, neutral, and/or hostile environments for trans faculty? So rather than recount the entirety of my literature review, I'm just going to give an overview of my core argument and then sort of conclude with a little chunk around what I call being the other, sort of harkening back to what Joy already articulated. So there are a number of educational benefits to having a diverse faculty, especially the contributions that diverse faculty might make through their traditional roles of teaching, research, and service. Yet there are a number of barriers that exist that prevent the full realization of those benefits. But when I say benefits, what I really mean is a mutually reinforcing environment where people get to offer their gifts and that those gifts are received and appreciated. But there are barriers like racism, sexism, heterosexism, genderism, and misogyny that prevent the ability for that mutually reinforcing positive environment to really flourish. And given the interconnected nature of all oppression, understanding how genderism in particular, this idea that there are 2 and only 2 genders, is shaping individuals' experiences, as well as analyzing the other kinds of barriers that exist, is vitally important within this research. I sort of conclude my dissertation or my literature review by sort of situating trans academics as being part of a larger network of individuals who are the other, right, who do not fit certain kinds of norms within the academy. I describe the partially shared experiences that trans academics have with faculty of color and with white women as being the other. Other minoritized scholars often face challenges within academic environments, struggling for recognition, coping with a lack of institutional support. But rather ironically, the very kinds of knowledge that are produced by minoritized individuals and often are embodied kinds of wisdom are the very sources of knowledge desired most by institutions, yet when minoritized scholars move through the academy, often there's a sense of exclusion and isolation. In the larger literature review, I also address the literature that speaks to LGBTQ academics, as well as the librarianship as an academic profession, and then an extensive review of transgender workplace discrimination literature. I ended my literature review with the conceptual framework. This framework has 3 parts. The outer box is the institutional logics perspective, which is a sociological perspective in the ways in which a suprastructure comes to influence organizations. The inner part is inequality regimes, so within organizational processes that create inequalities that extend out into social inequalities. And then critical trans politics, which is the piece on the right side of the screen, the resistance component. So I'm going to go piece by piece and break this down a little bit. So institutions are the supra-organizational patterns of activities, and the logics are the material practices and the symbolic constructions. Taken together, institutional logics are the socially constructed historical pattern of material practices. It involves assumptions, beliefs, and values, which individuals and organizations use to provide meaning to their activity. It's also a way in which lives are produced and reproduced. Inequality regimes is similar to what Powell and Kolivas described as micro-foundations. These are small within institution forces that shape individual interests and desires. They frame the possibilities for action, but also influence whether behaviors result in persistence or change within organizations. So what Powell and Kolivas describe is somewhat similar to what Acker offered in inequality regimes, only Acker is offering this sort of notion that this is creating social inequalities and inequities. So inequality regimes are systematic disparities between organizational participants regarding power and control over about goals, resources, and outcomes. It's also about, does one have the ability to take pleasure in their work? The third piece is critical trans politics. And I used Spade's notion of critical trans politics, which is the idea that there's a need for a trans politics that demands more than legal recognition and inclusion. Instead, it's about transforming current logics of state, civil society, security, and social equality. So rather than seek to secure certain kinds of rights, critical trans politics focuses on reshaping logics and directs attention towards sites where gender is more highly regulated. And this perspective is built on a foundation of critical theory, as well as women of color feminisms, which are quite evident in my analyses. So let's talk a little bit about the methods and the participants. This is a qualitative interview study that had 39 participants, of which 12 held master's degrees, 27 held PhDs. The average time at the institution is 5.75 years, so actually relatively short, though there was a pretty wide range. Across the bottom of the screen is a bar graph that indicates the different types of academic appointments and the rank for those who are in ranked positions. The darkest green color is the adjunct or contingent faculty, which is now the majority. And you can see that I do have participants who are across the range of tenure track appointment, as well as 5 librarians. So speaking about the participants in terms of their gender identity, sexual orientation, age, and a couple of other demographic pieces, folks used things like trans, tranny, female, man, transgender woman, transmasculine, and so on to describe their gender identity, a wide range of terms. But in terms of sexual orientation, folks used words like queer, gay, straight, lesbian, and pansexual. In terms of age, I had across the lifespan of what we might expect academics to have, 28 to 67 with a mean of 42. And there were discipline clusters that I created around the humanities, sciences, and social sciences. And I had solid representation in the 3 of those clusters, though the vast majority of the sample comes from humanities and social sciences. The racial and ethnic identities included white, African American, Black, Native American, multiracial, Middle Eastern, Jewish, Latina, and Jewish as a standalone identity. So the overwhelming majority of participants are white and transmasculine, which actually reflects the larger norms within the academic profession. So here it is playing out as well in the trans faculty. So in terms of data collection, I recruited participants primarily through the Trans Academics listserv. I also recruited via social media and through snowball sampling efforts. Participants completed an interest survey, and then I engaged in purposeful sampling to select people who would present either a different disciplinary perspective, who brought a different kind of social identity in some way. And participants completed 2 interviews and narrative responses. The first interview focused on the organizational context, and the second focused on their identities as well as the ways in which they navigate institutional context with those identities. 36 of the 39 participants completed the narrative prompt and response, which was about a memorable moment and what that moment meant to them as a trans academic. In terms of the modes of analysis, I engaged in what I call a queer methodologies, which Halberstam described as a scavenger methodology. So I was scavenging for a variety of different kinds of ways that I would engage in data analysis. And I relied on portraiture, thematic analysis, and thinking with theory, each of which arrive out of different qualitative research traditions, research paradigms, and in some ways are in tension and really fraught with contradiction. And as my analysis will show, the tensions and contradictions in my analytical approach actually fit the data. Therefore, my deliberate choice of an analytical approach that's about data reduction, thematic analysis, and one that's about not reducing data, proliferating possibilities, thinking with theory, right? These are fundamentally opposed kinds of methods, and I used both of them. Because why not? Because then I could have 3 things, and I wanted 3 things at every point. So in terms of trustworthiness and credibility, I used a member checking process, and sometimes this just consists of sending a transcript. In my case, participants had an opportunity to provide me extensive feedback on reflective questions, and many of them engaged thoughtfully and deeply with my work, providing 2 or more single-space pages in response. And so this is a unique way that I engaged in member checking that's maybe different than the ways that others have. In terms of analytic triangulation, I collected multiple sources of data from each individual participant and relied heavily on 4 peer debriefers, one of which is here, thank you. And then I engaged in thick and rich description of the findings and negotiated confidentiality individually with participants. So some people wanted lots of confidentiality and others wanted almost none at all. Use my real name, my institution, my official title, all of those things. And then also through that member check process, I worked to co-construct knowledge alongside trans faculty. So I'm going to give some data snippets as I sort of work through the 4 findings chapters briefly. And so this first chapter really focused on a thematic analysis of the microfoundations or inequality regimes. And I developed 3 themes. The first is around misgendering, which occurred both interpersonally but in digital spaces as well, hypervisibility and invisibility, and then exercising agency over one's trans identity, status, and history, disclosures regarding one's identity. So with respect to misgendering of the interpersonal variety, I draw on Rowan, who is a full-time non-tenure track lecturer in statistics at a research university in the Midwest. Rowan identifies as non-binary, gender non-conforming, and is white. Rowan said, "Sometimes I feel invisible because of the use of default pronouns for me like she, or when I get called Mrs. Moore. Don't put any pronoun there, use doctor, that is my title." And when I asked Rowan, well, why don't you tell people what your pronouns are? Rowan said, "It doesn't feel appropriate for me. It never seems appropriate in my classroom to do that." And so I described the situation that Rowan is in as being up against the wall. And those of you who have read Sarah Ahmed know exactly what I mean. This wall is genderism, right? It makes discussions of pronouns seem inappropriate, yet it allows genderism and misgendering to be quite commonplace. And so while Rowan alluded in comments about feeling invisible, there were other participants that the process of misgendering made them hypervisible, like Mary, or Max, who became hypervisible because of both his race and his gender as a Black man in librarianship. The microfoundations that created a context of misgendering led to a kind of inequality regime wherein trans academics had to engage in additional labor that could be easily avoided. And it is through this additional labor that trans academics have the shared experience of being professionally other. In the second findings chapter, I used thematic analysis and portraiture methodology along with the notion of the farmer's market as a metaphor to explore the ways that institutional logics emerge within participants' experiences. I found the market and corporation logics to be the most salient of the institutional logics. And in some cases, these were intertwined, where the market and corporate logic came together. Gabe, a white male pre-tenure assistant professor in the humanities at a regional comprehensive institution in the Midwest, expressed concerns about the ways in which the market logic, academic capitalism, and neoliberalism influenced his work experiences. And as a result of the market niche that his institution seeks to fill, his courses have to be, quote, as open as possible and as generalized as possible to slot into the needs of returning adult learners. And the result of having to cater to students in this particular way and to achieve the course objectives ultimately meant that Gabe felt like he was fighting for his academic freedom. He views the moves that are made by his department as being more about a consumer model. Give them what they need to get through the pipeline. The market and the corporate logics were also evident within academic libraries and across various institutional types. Nick, a non-binary and gender non-conforming Native American man and academic librarian at a public research university in the Midwest, spoke about the values within his department and said, "The only other thing I would mention, which is true of academic institutions more generally, is the business model. Trying to find ways to market, promote, and sometimes even monetize our services is interesting in the library context because we're not for profits. But we have this business mentality. We have a business manager here for the library. Not all libraries do, but that's a change, really seeing the library as a business, a place of transaction." Nick described this business model, which is symbolized by the business manager and materially manifested in efforts like marketing, promotion, and monetizing services. Nick went on to talk about how this business model is alienating, which I then took up in the third findings chapter, which I used a variety of thresholds to talk through tensions within trans academics' experiences. And so I'm going to spend a moment in just a second talking about one of those thresholds. But the 4 thresholds are isolation and community, alienation and familiarity, precarity and security, and silence and voice. In this final findings chapter, I also looked at the ways in which trans academics were able to disrupt and resist. I drew on this notion that Lugonis asserted that resistance hardly ever has a straightforward public presence. It's rather duplicitous, ambiguous, even devious, but it's almost always masked and hidden by structures of meaning and continence and constitute domination. Indeed, masked and hidden by the structures of meaning were places where trans academics were able to resist and disrupt within the academy. So now I'll return to a threshold and start to talk a little bit about silence and voice. As Caputo wrote, we're going to talk about silence, an impossible task. But Mazai advanced this idea that silence is meaningful and purposeful. Foucault would have argued that silence is the absolute limit of discourse, the thing that cannot be said. But it is also about the haunting that one experiences between words. As Joy said, being silenced about difference is a pretty standard way of marginalizing it. Indeed, silence served as a way to marginalize trans identities, but also to draw the line between the center and the margin, making it that trans is not a part of the center of the teaching machine in Spivak's language. I describe silence in two ways. First, the overall silence within the data, especially related to socioeconomic status, ability, sexism, and transmisogyny. There's one exception to this assertion, which comes from Karen, a European-American transgender woman who is a tenured associate professor in the sciences at a liberal arts college. She spoke only briefly about sexism when she said, "Sometimes I'm reaping the benefits of male privilege because some of my colleagues aren't making the mental switch. At other times, I think I'm getting the woman treatment, and I never quite know. I never quite know when I'm experiencing very subtle sexism, but doubly so because you don't even really know if this person in their heart of hearts even sees you as a woman." So these silences matter, but so do the palpable silences that participants sat with in their work, and AJ provides one example of this. AJ is a white, trans, and genderqueer person and a tenure-track assistant professor in the social sciences at a women's college. AG's college recently addressed trans inclusion in their admissions policy and described the situation as follows. When we have the trans admissions policy discussions, I did a lot of education around that, both on campus and beyond. I'll say that I felt very unsupported during the media attention that happened. The complete silence was deafening. No one reached out to me. No one said anything to me. No one said anything positive. No one said anything negative. And it's not like people didn't know that this was going on. This was a months-long crisis level situation. Yet there was nothing. There was nothing. And that repetitive refrain, "there was nothing," is quite telling, because in the silence, they did in fact say something. While AJ felt that AJ could no longer rely on any of these people, AJ ultimately felt vulnerable when no one responded to these efforts. But sometimes silence was directed at trans people versus trans issues. And Jackson described one incident of this. Jackson's a white Southern male who's a graduate instructor in the social sciences at a research university in the Midwest. Midwest is popular today. He explained that some of his department did not see trans as, quote, "a legitimate category or a minority status. So everyone sees me as a white man. How can I complain about anything because I'm a heterosexual white man?" And even like queer faculty members and faculty of color have said similar things to me like, "Oh, you're the white man now." This is a negation of trans experiences, eliding the fact that Jackson might move through the world differently than cisgender white men might. And opposing silence is voice. And as I have shared some voices here, I take up what Alicia Jackson called rhizovocality, the idea that voice is not to be seen as some decisive action or indicator of truth, but rather that voices are multiple and contingent. Voices are discursively formed through particular social and historical conditions, but so is silence. Indeed, voice and silence are deeply intertwined and more complex than my cursory discussion today. I want to close my discussion of the findings with a brief overview of the resistance that trans academics within this study engaged in, and then I'll lead into the implications. There were 4 kinds of resistance. First, trans academics resist by being present, and Jay, a white genderqueer assistant professor in the social sciences at a private liberal arts college in the East, described resistance through presence in the following way. "We all had queer teachers growing up that mattered to us, that mattered emotionally in ways that were incredibly significant, often not because they were doing anything in particular, but just because they existed. That's the way in which I want to be visible on campus. That's the form of activism I want to engage in." But trans academics also disrupted cisgender norms and expectations, particularly through pronoun usage and gender expression, and also through resisting inequality regimes around race and national belonging, and finally resisting and disrupting through their traditional roles of teaching, research, and service. And so now I'll draw on Martina, a Latina female and full professor in the sciences at a liberal arts college in the West, who described her, quote, "legacy," which is built on the efforts to resist race, gender, and class-based inequality regimes that are present and reproduced in and through higher education. She said, "My deal was how many people White women, students of color, have I placed in high places because of what I did. That's always been my barometer of success, and it still is. And then she went on to talk about how she was resilient, describing herself as bulletproof. And there's not really much that will stop her, she says. There's nothing that's going to slow me down because of that background I described, coming from a place of poverty as well as having few possibility models for success. Trans academics, including Martina, must be bulletproof in their resistance and in their disruptions within the academy, serving as both accomplices and advocates within the neoliberal, market, and corporate-driven academy. So now I'll move on to talk a bit about implications. I asked participants for what needed to change within higher education, and there was certainly some consensus around things like healthcare. But through my analysis, I realized that academics in this study wanted to remove the thorns in their sides and the rocks in their shoes. They wanted to get rid of those things. And that makes sense, but I don't think they're going to lead us to liberation. And so I argue that the kinds of coalitional politics that Spade advanced might lead us towards liberation. Cassidy, a Native American female and adjunct instructor in the humanities at a research university in the West, described the devastation that the movement towards this market-driven corporate academy has meant for contingent faculty. She says, the reality is that they, institutional leaders, gravitate to their finances, cutting salaries, and the provost has even come out and said as much. You're expendable, you're a dime a dozen, we can get as much of you as we want. We don't have to be nice to you, we don't have to do these things. We don't have to treat you like a human. You're just grist for the mill. And when one is treated like grist for the mill, building a coalition of academics who have partially shared experiences becomes even more important. And the aim of that coalition is to respond to Cassidy's concern and connecting to what Spade and others have theorized as population level controls. Things like racism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism, and xenophobia. And because trans academics experience isolation and silence, there's a profound need for company, as Lugonis calls it. Thus, I call for a both-and strategy. We literally need to remove the rocks from people's shoes and the thorns from their sides. We need more all-gender spaces and fewer sex-segregated ones. We need more gender autonomy and less gendered assumptions. But we also need to pay attention to those population-level controls that are at play and resist those forces through our research, policy, practice, and theory. I proposed several lines of inquiry in the final chapter, and here I'll just say that I think it's important that we continue to study trans academics, but it's especially important that we pay attention to the ways in which trans people of color and trans women experience the academy, but also finding ways in which people are resisting and figuring out how are their resistance efforts successful or not and why. So let me briefly articulate what I see as the contributions of this study. This is now my second systematic exploration of trans workplace experiences in the academy. I documented institutional conditions that adversely affect trans academics and connected the study of diversity-related topics to organizational theories. And so I'll conclude with Susan, a white, settler, female-to-male transsexual, and associate professor in the humanities at a research university in the Southwest, who said, I remain convinced that the university is actually a place to struggle within, as always having an undercommons to it, like a shared subaltern space of people who are not necessarily endorsing the goals of the master of the house. I think that using resources that are at the university to do the political work of empowering an oppressed minority through how you help produce and reproduce knowledge out to them and by and for them, I'm committed to that. So may those of you who sit under the press of the normative be committed to the undercommons, that subaltern space where intersectional coalitional politics may bloom. Thank you.
Now's the part where everybody takes a deep breath. Eric, I think it's just what we talked about this part. Why can't people leave and we have our conversation?
Yes. Yeah.
We did.
We did.
Okay. All right. I forgot. So this is the moment which thank you all for being with us for this exciting presentation. And really, I mean, one more time.
Now you're
think of a sideline with like slides.
Oh.
So you will all sit out. We will have a conversation, and look forward to letting you know the outcomes.
Okay, so folks who are online, I'm going to stop the recording now and have the conversation with the committee, and then I will send an email out a bit later today. So I can't actually hear any of you. So thank you for joining, and then I'll be in touch soon. Take care. Okay.